Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning. We are going to get right into the discussion, but before we do, I want to introduce all of our panelists. We have Deborah Berlin with Consumer Policy Solutions, Mary Brown with Cisco, Andy Clegg with Google, John Godfrey with Samsung, Hank Holquist down there at AT&T, and all the way at the end, we have Brian Regan with Starry. I wanted to talk today about both infrastructure, especially Commissioner Carr's news, and Spectrum. But before we jump into that, I thought it would be good for everybody to just kind of talk about their interest in 5G and their thoughts on how the U.S. is doing. So we can kick it off with Deborah. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to CTA for convening this event, WBK for hosting, and thank you, Commissioner Carr, for your great remarks. I see we are divided like my middle school at a dance here. We got the girls on one side, the guys on the other. And a rarity here, the consumer interest gets to go first. This is great. Thank you, Margaret. I want to talk about 5G and consumers and highlight the what and the how. And so in terms of the what, I want to talk about a few examples of innovative products in development today with 5G technology that deliver amazing benefits for consumers. So first we hear all about remote medical services, and here's one from Ericsson that has already undergone successful trials. So using cutting-edge 5G network infrastructure in combination with the world's most advanced surgical robotics, the team at King's College has created the ability to allow remote transfer of haptic, tactile, audio, and visual technologies. This has enabled surgeons and doctors to perform a diagnosis or even surgery on a patient anywhere in the world. A doctor uses specialized haptic feedback gloves and virtual reality equipment to operate on a patient via a robotic counterpart potentially thousands of miles away. Secondly, 5G offers smart city planning for lighting, energy, and waste management that are super efficient, saving real dollars for consumers. And finally, we hear a great deal about self-driving vehicles and 5G, but here's a unique example to illustrate the future of transportation that serves the interest of everyone. At CES, I had an opportunity to visit a booth that was demonstrating a joint venture of IBM and an independent car maker, Local Motors. They've developed a self-driving electric shuttle bus called Ollie that combines artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and smartphone apps to serve people with vision, hearing, physical, and cognitive disabilities. This connected vehicle offers accessible public transportation and an improved quality of life for the community. As for the how of getting these great 5G benefits to consumers, Commissioner Carr has just provided us with some important regulatory ways to speed deployment of 5G. This helps lead us on the path not only to 5G, but to real benefits for consumers. Thanks, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Mary, you want to take it from there?
Hi, thanks Margaret, and thanks CTA for inviting me today. So you may wonder what Cisco's interest is in 5G. We're a networking solutions and services company in San Jose, California. And from our perspective, 5G isn't just about the spectrum or the antennas and the placements that we just heard about, but the core of the network itself. And that core network is having to undergo a radical overhaul to prepare for 5G. To prepare for higher gigabit throughput, to prepare for ultra-low latency, to prepare for the massive scale we're going to see these networks use when delivering services to the Internet of Things. So the key message for today, guess what? Those changes are here today and are already being embedded in service provider networks throughout the US and indeed throughout the world. The core network technologies are ready. We have support for multiple radio edge technologies, not just 3GPP technologies anymore, but an array of radio technologies at the edge. We have new security to catch, contain, and alert the service provider before the threat strikes their network. I'm using that term deliberately, before the threat strikes their network. We have programmable infrastructure and network slicing, which is fancy engineering talk for the following. It enables the service providers to move beyond entities that are selling buckets of minutes to entities that are going to be selling services, IoT services, into verticals, such as mining or retail or transportation, right? And it enables a whole new level of automation, both automating network functionality as well as automating customer service in ways that never before were possible. So, with that being said, I'm going to keep my comments brief. The core network, we're ready. We're 5G ready today. Thanks to the announcement this morning, it sounds like we're well on our way to getting the infrastructure problems cleared up. So all we need now is not just the allocation of spectrum, but the delivery of spectrum into the hands of people who are going to use it. Thank you.
Thank you. Andy.
Okay, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Commissioner Carr, and thanks to CTA for hosting the event. So I'm not sure if everybody has the same view of what 5G is or what it means to them, but I think everybody can agree that ultimately 5G is a wireless technology. It requires spectrum, it requires the ability to get signals across the air in order to do whatever it is we're going to do. More broadband, more Internet of Things, more YouTube streaming, whatever. It's all about spectrum. And as the PCAST report pointed out several years ago, the amount of spectrum, especially below about 10 gigahertz, that is easily cleared and made available for exclusive use, licensed mobile spectrum, the type of stuff that the major operators are using now, is dwindling, and we have to take a new view of how we're going to achieve our spectrum requirements. What the Commission has done in the high band is great. There's going to be great opportunities for broadband deployments in high band spectrum, but there are some challenges there. And what the Commission has been doing below 10 gigahertz, and particularly in, for example, 3.5 gigahertz CBRS, we think sort of is what the future of spectrum access is going to look like. It's going to enable 5G and 6G and beyond. And that is, we're going to have to find ways to share spectrum and make the most of the bandwidth that we have. We think there's tremendous opportunities given the increasing detail available in various cloud databases in terms of buildings and trees and all sorts of other things, knowing the propagation environment and the sharing environment much, much better than we ever have in the past. And we think that spectrum sharing and making use of the vast increase in geo data type databases is going to drive some of these access paradigms. So Google is one of the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum access system providers, and we see that is sort of the first stepping stone of how spectrum access for 5G and beyond is going to happen. And so I'll keep my remarks short, but I think in that framework, we think spectrum sharing is going to become a very critical component of future wireless networks.
It only took 5 minutes for 6G to come up. Please, Andy, let's enjoy 5G. No, you're right. We do have to look to the future. Samsung is very excited about 5G, and yes, the U.S. is leading in 5G, and there's some reasons for that. First, the leadership of the FCC in setting a regulatory environment for 5G, for investment. The announcement today from Commissioner Carr is really important, and I think Anna will spend some more time on that, because that's very important to getting 5G deployed. Equally important is the United States leadership in spectrum. The 5G is not any one spectrum band. There's low, middle, and high that all has to work together. But I'll tell you that the star of the show, from Samsung's point of view, is the millimeter wave spectrum. the Samsung researchers started working, I believe it was in 2012, the first time I saw it in the labs, on taking this very, very high frequency spectrum that doesn't propagate very far, and proving that it could actually be used for mobile. And I remember coming to the FCC to talk about it, I think Brian might have been there, and explaining that this spectrum that wasn't getting used a lot in the United States might actually have a very exciting new use for it. And the reason I would say it's the star of the show is because the incredible amount of capacity there. Really, there's, at higher bands, there's much fatter pipes, much more capacity. And so that's what's going to, along with some of the other breakthroughs of 5G, latency, and massive number of devices, it's the capacity and high data rates. And so the FCC responded and led the way with a Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, and there are more proceedings coming. As Commissioner Carr mentioned, the FCC will be auctioning, Chairman Pai announced, auctioning the 28 gigahertz spectrum by the end of this year. And last Friday, on February 23rd, Samsung and the FCC achieved a milestone. We became the first in the world to receive regulatory approval for 5G millimeter wave equipment. The FCC authorized our 5G access units, as Chairman Pai mentioned, in Barcelona. And so, as a regulator, the FCC is forging ahead. So, lots more to say, but I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
I think this is working. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you to CTA. Thank you to Commissioner Carr, whose remarks I just want to say, wow. I think these proposed reforms in the rules around the historic and environmental processes associated with this deployment of small cells will have a huge impact, significant material, really change the game and lead to more widespread deployment of small cells. So it's fantastic. I love the kind of, Margaret said, let's talk about your interest in 5G. Okay, I'll stipulate, AT&T has an interest in 5G.
You can add on from there, yeah.
We announced last week, we had a release announcing that we would be deploying mobile standards-based 5G to 12 cities this year. Announced 3 of them being Dallas, Atlanta, and Waco. We are so excited about that. We have long been working through the standards process with others who are here and many others who are not here. We have had labs underway. We currently have 4 5G labs working in the country. We are looking forward to deploying 5G, I think as John suggests, first in the millimeter wave bands, ultimately reaching to all our bands, I suspect. I want to reiterate a point Mary made, which I think gets lost because there's so much focus on spectrum around 5G, but the promise of 5G, while spectrum is the enabler of it, it will really only be achieved through fundamental changes in the network design supporting that. And those changes are profound. It's changes that will lead to low latency, that will, that through the use of things like software-defined networks, network function virtualization, through the introduction and widespread deployment of edge computing, these will really enable completely different use cases. It's not about a handset or a tablet anymore. With 5G, there will be many kinds of appliances and devices that are able to take advantage of these capabilities because of the introduction of these elements into the network. It will enable rapid introduction of new applications, testing, deployment. I mean, this is going to fundamentally change the way we, not just communicate, but also compute. I mean, it's really a change in a computing architecture as much as communication. And so, yes, AT&T has an interest in it. We're really excited. I personally am looking forward to the discussion on this panel. Thank you. Sure.
Really cool.
Yeah. So, right, well, thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, as Brendan's suggesting, Starry is a startup, if you couldn't tell by the difference in style of photos and headshots. Well, thanks for CTA for hosting, for having Starry on the panel, Commissioner Carr for your continued leadership on this.
And for everyone in the audience for sticking around, I fully expected after the headliner to be a mass exodus, so we'll try to keep it exciting up here. As mentioned, as revealed by my headshot, Starry is a startup. We've developed our own millimeter wave technology for the deployment of fixed wireless broadband. Our mission is to increase broadband competition and connectivity across the United States and across the world. I think recent FCC data shows that 85% of the developed census tracts in the United States have only one or zero providers offering 100 megabit per second down, 10 megabit per second up broadband service. Sorry, when you sign up for us, you get 200 meg down, 200 meg up at a low price, no contract, great customer service. We think we can do better. So our mission is to do that across the country and across the globe ultimately. We're able to do that in a couple of ways. One is by dramatically reducing the cost of deploying a network. We are an equipment manufacturer. We develop our own equipment. We deploy our own equipment. We sign up our own customers. We provide our own service. We're one of the few companies in the world that are currently doing that right now. Another tool we have is the use of millimeter wave spectrum. It is incredibly powerful for providing really high capacity service at a relatively low cost. We're able to provide 200 megabits per second symmetrical, largely because of the combination of our technology and the opportunity to use millimeter wave spectrum. And third, we rely on 802.11 radios instead of mobile ecosystem built and developed radios. What that allows us to do is get access to a really incredibly powerful, robust radio ecosystem that's at a much lower cost, and then we take that up, convert it to millimeter wave frequencies for the use in our network. Combining all those things together, we're able to dramatically reduce the cost of deploying a fixed wireless broadband network, which we can then therefore pass on to consumers as we deploy across the country. Our interest in 5G is, I think, probably pretty obvious. We're operating in Boston right now, passing about 250,000 homes in Boston. In January of this year, we announced we're launching in DC and LA, and up to an additional 14 cities this year.
All right, great. Thank you all. I think we should start with the news that Commissioner Carr was kind enough to make this morning, which is great for me. I try and be fast. Okay, so Hank, you talked about this having a huge impact. I think I read that AT&T was predicting it would spend something like $45 million on these reviews, or in compliance with these environmental and historic preservation reviews next year. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of like how these reviews costs add up, what your experience has been, and how it gets to be that high of a cost?
Sure. So thank you. And Commissioner Carr really covered, I think, a lot of the facts on the ground that lead to these costs. I mean, under the existing rules that were developed, in the context of the deployment of macro-type wireless infrastructure, the application to small cells is challenging. And so, as you said, we recently filed an ex parte in which we estimated that with compliance with the current rules, with the kind of pace that we expect to be deploying small cells, we would probably generate about $45 million in costs. About 29 million of that, is tribal alone, and so really the fees and the process associated with the tribal aspects of Section 106 are a significant driver of this. And I think Commissioner Carr did a great job, sort of explaining how you can have circumstances, whether it's the stadium in Houston or the fact that you can have deployments that, from a appearance perspective, look very much the same, but the fact that one of them happens to be using licensed spectrum and the other license generates different results in terms of whether there is any compliance cost here. I mean, this process is a significant sort of break deterrent to the speed with which these small cells get deployed. And right now, small cells are being deployed to add capacity to 4G LTE networks, but this really does, in a very short amount of time, these small cells will be deployed primarily for 5G service. And so these changes in the process that we have estimated, potentially could result in, us being able to deploy maybe as many as 1,000 additional small cells in a year. This is a tremendous, opportunity here for the commission to take a concrete action that will materially improve the ability of providers to invest in the infrastructure needed for 5G.
Okay, sounds like AT&T is very much in support of this then. Hey, Brian, I wanted to ask you, Starry launching in Boston, very historic city. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the siting rules that you've encountered and how Starry's dealt with those.
Sure, absolutely, and very much echo Hank's comments and very much appreciate the commissioner's leadership on this. I think it builds on years of focus the commission's had, and I know Brendan's had a real role in that over the last few years to push infrastructure forward, to reduce the barriers to deployment, and try to make some of these things a lot easier. And I think the things Brendan talked about today are going to make a big impact on the ability to deploy small cells in the context of 5G, so very much appreciated. In Boston, we started out in doing two things. One is having a conversation with the city early in the process. So as we were going through the process of actually designing our own equipment, we sat down with the city planners, the historic review board, and tried to figure out the issues that they were going to be most concerned about and what we could do on the front end to design our equipment to meet those concerns. That's a relatively unique situation. It's one city. We were in the process of designing equipment, so we had that opportunity to actually do that at the front end of the process. That's not going to be the case with 5G writ large, and I certainly understand and appreciate that. So establishing that relationship was helpful. We built the equipment in a way that met their needs. So our base stations are 18 inches by 18 inches. There's no associated cabinet with it. And our receive antennas are about 12 inches by 12 inches. So design them from the beginning to be as small and compact as possible. And then we've actually designed a whole suite of additional form factors to meet historical issues. So Boston is very much a historic city. Places like Back Bay are very difficult to deploy in. We've had to go through a process of actually designing specific equipment in a way that meets the historic preservation needs, things that look like stovepipes or chimney on a rooftop, things that meet the facade of a building. We've got different colors. We've gone through the process of doing that. Again, in Boston, it's one city. It's a relatively easy thing for us to do now at the front end. But as a startup, you sort of experience these things as they come. And I am fully confident that as we get to other cities across the country, we're going to experience a whole host of different issues as we go across them. And I think everything that the Commission can do to help streamline those issues as much as they can is going to be a huge help.
Thank you. John, I was hoping you could talk about how siting in the U.S. Compares with other countries, some of these rules and processes, and if the U.S. does have some catching up to do.
Well, thank you. I wish I could. I actually focus on U.S. siting, although I can tell you that in South Korea, which I visit a few times a year, they have really excellent macro cell towers disguised as pine trees. They do an especially good job with the fake foliage there, but I don't get engaged in the site process over there. But in the U.S., it is definitely an issue, and so the improvements that Commissioner Carr announced today are definitely going to make a difference. I also hope that cities and localities will see what the FCC is doing and follow that lead, because as the Commissioner mentioned, there is still local zoning involved in both co-locations and new locations of equipment. And that process can be, getting those approvals can be expensive and unpredictably time-consuming in some cases. And so two things I want to say about that. One, you've heard mentioned a few times how small these base stations are, in particular for the higher frequencies, the millimeter wave, and some of the mid-band. The thing to know is that high frequency means shorter wavelengths, which means smaller antennas, which means the base station doesn't have to be big, it can be small. These can be unobtrusive devices. So that's why we're talking about small things. They're not going to be distracting or in the way for your city. The second thing that I wanted to mention about that is cities should think about what 5G means for their citizens and their economy. The smartest cities are going to be 5G cities. And that means having an environment that will attract investment in building 5G infrastructure. I think we may, if we have time in the panel, talk a little bit more about some of the use cases for 5G in terms of transportation safety, public safety, in terms of environmental protection, in terms of innovation in enterprise use, and of course, in terms of consumer enjoyment of 5G. The Consumer Technology Association is all about consumers, and so cities that are open to 5G investment are going to benefit.
I do want to talk more about the consumer case. I know, Deb, would you want to add on to, from the consumer's perspective, what 5G could bring?
Sure. So, in my opening remarks, I did mention some of that, and I'd like to pick up on it and mention that as many of you may know, I also have a project that focuses on, it's called Project Goal, Getting Older Adults Online, which focuses on the aging community. And also there's a significant overlap with the accessibility and disability community as well. And 5G brings to those communities a tremendous value. So, we all know with medical services and devices, remote health monitoring, et cetera, what it can bring. It helps that community to age well, to age in place with fitness devices, connected homes, certainly self-driving vehicles, public transportation, the list goes on and on. And for the disability community, I could talk about so many new devices that are here today, will be evolving with 5G, going to CES, the booths just grow and grow every year. For the vision impaired, there are devices that allow someone who cannot see to navigate city streets. It's just amazing. There are smartphone applications that can tell you what you are looking at, from fruits and vegetables to the person who's standing in front of you. So it's absolutely amazing. For consumers in general, everybody wants it faster and better. And I don't think our older adults, our disability community, or consumers want these innovations to be put on hold. And to put it simply, deployment delays are consumer benefits denied.
And another big part of that is getting spectrum out there. And I think we're going to shift to talk about some spectrum news this week. Chairman Pai talked about holding an auction for high band spectrum in the 28 gigahertz and then also the 24 gigahertz bands in November, which is not that far away. Andy, I was hoping I know you talked about 3.5 a little bit and Google's interest there, but what about up in the high frequency airways? What do you think? Do you think Google would be interested in those auctions? Let's make some more news.
Let me check my wallet and see if I have money. I think, not speaking about what we are or aren't interested in, we think from the 5G viewpoint, like I said earlier, it's going to require spectrum in all parts of the band, low, mid, and high band spectrum to accomplish what we, all of us, sort of see as 5G. So we encourage as much spectrum to get out there as possible. The advantage of the high frequency spectrum, the high band spectrum, of course, as I think John said earlier, there is a potential for tremendous bandwidth there. And because your throughput in megabits a second or whatever depends on the bandwidth, high band spectrum obviously is going to be key to providing gigabit or multi-gigabit type throughput, as actually some wireless providers already are in high band spectrum. So we're certainly all in favor of high band spectrum as part of the very high throughput component. But the mobility component of 5G, if you think about it, if we all are in self-driving cars in the near future, what are we going to do in our car while we're self-driving? Suddenly you can do anything you want because the car is driving itself. and most likely we're going to be consuming vast amounts of streaming something, movies, whatever, video conferences, something. And millimeter wave spectrum is not ideal typically for that type of capability. Maybe in cities where your car is stuck in traffic on one block, but of course if it's self-driving, it will never be stuck in traffic, so that's kind of cool. But if you're on a highway and you need longer propagation range, you have to rely more on mid and low band spectrum. And so we think that spectrum is complementary to all of the different parts of the spectrum are complementary. And like I said earlier, there's little to no mid and low band spectrum, especially towards the lower range, that is clearable and exclusively licensable. So we think just from a license model, 5G is going to require a combination of exclusive licensed mobile spectrum, fixed point to multi-point spectrum, and unlicensed spectrum. It's going to require more spectrum for all of these. And I know that the commission, and right now there's various proceedings and notices of inquiry regarding access to new spectrum, but we're going to need all of those to make 5G work.
Well, on that note, were you hoping to see a 3.5 auction before this 28, or I guess how does the fact that the commission's going up high first kind of factor into? There are several steps that have to happen before the 3.5 gigahertz auction. And actually, because of the way 3.5 is structured, we can start using the band without an auction. There's the general authorized access. And people often think of GAA as unlicensed. It's actually not. It's licensed spectrum. So, there's some citing issues involved there too, as well. But the benefit of 3.5 and the way that band is structured is we can use it before the auction happens. I think the auction is going to take a while. My personal opinion is that 28 will happen before the 3.5 gigahertz auction, but 3.5 gigahertz will be used first because of the GAA. Okay, we are going to do audience questions in just a minute, so everybody start thinking up some good ones for everybody up here. I do want to put Hank on the spot and ask him about the 28 gigahertz auction. I know that AT&T filed an auction design for a different high frequency band, but what's your interest in 28 and 24?
So I think if I don't want to sort of signal anything about strategy here. I would say that 24 is a band that's pretty open, and I think that there can be 24 will be a good band for auction. I think 28, there's a significant portion of it is already licensed, and so there won't be as much spectrum available at auction in 28. But we're very happy to see that the commission has announced that it's moving forward with auctions in these high frequency bands. I think everybody has been getting across how important they will be to capacity for 5G. And I very much agree with Andy's comments that there will need to be coverage layer bands and other things. I mean, 5G ultimately will be, as I mentioned earlier, deployed throughout the commercial spectrum bands, the licensed bands, the shared bands. And so I think that is a very good point. And so like I said, we look forward to learning more about the auctions. We're excited. There is, of course, a caveat that I guess I'll mention, since Chairman Pine mentioned it also, is there is a barrier to spectrum auctions that Congress needs to clean up, having to do with changes that occurred in the banking regulations. I mean, it's funny to think that the banking, say we've got historic and environmental, we've got banking, all these things have implications for really this future of 5G.
Yes, there's that May 13th deadline, so we'll see. We'll see what happens there. I do want to also ask Brian really fast on the 28. Sorry, John. I want to ask Brian about the auctions in particular because I know Starry was worried about spectrum holding limits, and I was hoping you could kind of go into a little bit more detail about that and how it might factor into participation in the auction.
Yeah, sure. So I think we very much appreciate the fact that the chairman's focused on this, that he continues the march towards making millimeter wave band spectrum available. He did the spectrum frontiers order in November, announced another one for the second half of this year, and talked about scheduling the auction. I think our hope is that in the auction there's an opportunity to include additional bands. I know there's some complications with some of the bands, but as Hank mentioned, 28 gigahertz is largely consumed already by existing licenses. I think something like 15% of the megahertz pops is left in the commission's inventory. So hopefully there'll be a little bit more going into that. We did file some comments talking specifically about some competition-related spectrum holding reviews at the front end of the auction to help ensure that there's competitive access to spectrum. But more importantly than that, I think the millimeter wave bands present this opportunity for the commission to pursue a portfolio of spectrum access approaches. So there's exclusively licensed auction spectrum, there's a whole bunch of unlicensed spectrum, and the Commission also identified a near 600 megahertz for shared access as well, between 37 and 37.6 gigahertz. The opportunity in millimeter wave band is that there is so much spectrum available that the Commission can pursue all of these things simultaneously without any real cost associated with picking one alternative over another. In addition, the physics of millimeter wave spectrum make it really good for sharing. As John and Andy had mentioned, it goes in straight lines, it doesn't go through obstacles, it is relatively short in distance and coverage. So we think there's a real opportunity for the Commission to finalize those rules in the near term as well.
Great. John, did you want to add on the auction front? I saw that in my cluster over there for
Yeah, just one comment. I think one of the attractive things about the U.S. approach to allocating spectrum that makes it, stand out as a leader among policymakers around the world is the fact that the U.S. allows auction winners or license holders to choose what technology they want to use and choose what services they want to use. And the fact that we allocated all of these different bands we've been talking about without saying this one has to be used for mobile, or this one has to be used for 4G, or this one has to be used for 5G is a plus of the U.S. approach. And in the 28 gigahertz band in particular, it has been approved for mobile use. The uses that we've heard announced so far for now are fixed uses, but I'm sure AT&T and Starry and the other carriers are interested in part because without any changes in FCC rules, they'll be able to upgrade their networks to mobile. And the beams are steerable, so they can follow vehicles as they're cruising down the highway or people as they're walking down the street.
Before we go to audience questions, I did want to ask Mary, because you mentioned this before the panel, I said one of the most fascinating aspects of 5G is that the network is becoming radio agnostic. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that and why that's important.
Yeah, so this is not really so much a spectrum point, although it has spectrum implications, which is, in the old world, if you wanted to build a narrowband IoT network, you went out and got licensed spectrum for that, and you built that little silo, and you ran that as a silo network. All of that is a thing of the past with 5G. 5G is going to be able to interact with all kinds of radio technologies, so narrowband IoT technologies, sensor networks, LTE-M, which is a broader business use case, the fixed wireless services that some of the carriers are toying with now, Wi-Fi. So we're going to have a wide variety of radio technologies that are going to be able to integrate into a 5G network, not run as silos anymore, right? But you're able as an operator to orchestrate across those radio edges, which is fundamental change in how the networks will run. And I think has important spectrum implications.
Thank you. Let's do audience questions now before we run out of time. Oh, it's like Howard might have one.
I'm Howard Rusker from Communications Daily. I wanted to ask about, there was a little talk about mid-band spectrum, and this week we've seen a couple of announcements, or at least a couple of things, like 1.3 seems to be, NTIA is looking at the spectrum rate below CBRS. Other than CBRS spectrum, what do you all see as being the most promising mid-band spectrum bands?
So technically, CBRS isn't mid-band. The FCC in one of their in their notice of inquiry delineated mid-band as 3.7 to 24, which actually is an enormously different range of frequencies. 24 is very different from 3.7. But so if we make it a little more flexible and we consider CBRS to be mid-band spectrum, so the announcement from NTIA, the possibility of looking at 3450 to 3550, that's promising. There are some significant challenges for that portion of spectrum that I won't get into, but I hope that by putting that on the table, that we can take a closer look at trying to work with the incumbents in that portion of the band. It's both the military and there's also some non-federal government incumbents in 3450 to 3550, that if we could make it work, that would be very useful spectrum. I think that's probably the most, as of today, that's the most promising, assuming we can make that band work, because it gives another 100 megahertz to CBRS. That's 250 megahertz of contiguous mid-band spectrum potentially. And we think that could be a great inventory of spectrum in mid-band. Beyond that, in the flavor of that band, it extends down to about 3.1 gigahertz. What goes on in 3.1 to 3.5 is the same as what goes on in 3450 to 3.5. It's all part of one application. So if we could look at extending down towards 3.1, you could have potentially an enormous amount of bandwidth available, 600 megahertz of contiguous mid-band or upper low-band spectrum available. So to answer your question directly, the 3450 to 3550 is a good start, but then looking at extending the possibility of using down to 3.1 is probably a very encouraging portion of mid-band spectrum. 3.7 to 4.2 is also of considerable interest, and potentially even something that could be used much faster than anything below the CBRS band. 3.7 to 4.2 is occupied by fixed satellite service earth stations around the country, but we believe that there are tremendous sharing opportunities because those systems don't move. We know exactly where they are. We know their system characteristics exactly, and we can share with them. And so we think probably the lowest hanging fruit in mid-band spectrum right now would be to share 3.7 to 4.2. You don't even need to clear FSS out of it. We think in certain parts of the country, in certain fraction of the country, you could deploy point to multi-point in 3.7 to 4.2 without having any impact whatsoever on the fixed satellite service. So that 3.7 to 4.2 is probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of mid-band spectrum.
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. I guess I have a question for Commissioner Carr. So you talked about the item that the FCC is going to consider next month. The state historic preservation and tribal historic preservation folks have been very clear since you adopted the NPRM last year and your subsequent stuff you peeled off from that. They feel that, the tribal folks feel that you haven't really done real consultation, and both feel that, as well as the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation and some other historic preservation groups, that your planned action that you're talking about and what you all proposed in NPRM is not wise, and you shouldn't do it. So I just wanted to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, well,
Why don't you just briefly respond? Thank you. I don't think the characterization is entirely right. We actually engage in really, really extensive consultation with dozens and dozens of tribes and tribal nations through this process. As you'll see in the order, it lists the significant consultations we did. And I thought those were very helpful, very productive discussions. We also have engaged, obviously, with ACHP as well. And at the end of the day, I think there's going to be really good reforms that can promote additional deployment. And the document will release tomorrow, and you'll get to see even more about that, what I would say was a productive.
yeah, we'll just do one more quickly.
Yeah, thank you. This is Chris Arroyo with Development Action. I'd love to get your take, because I've been following rural broadband access very closely. And I'd love to see what your thoughts are around how everything we talked about today will improve internet access for folks in rural America.
Brian,
Yeah, sure. I'll kick it off. I'm sure others have thoughts here as well. I think the transition to 5G is a real opportunity for rural America. I think the use of millimeter wave frequencies to provide fixed broadband is a huge opportunity, particularly as the cost structure for that continues to fall. You're getting fiber-like speeds at a fraction of the cost of deployment. So the companies that are out there now, WISPs, that are doing a really good job of connecting communities that are either unconnected or lack really good competition, can ultimately use 3.5, they can use millimeter wave and a variety of other tools to continually improve the quality of broadband that's going to be deployed in rural areas. And hopefully as the cost structure continues to fall, fill in those gaps. So that's something we're going to be looking to in the future as our step of actually making some of our technology available to a broader ecosystem of providers, because we think it's important for other people to get access to low-cost millimeter wave technologies to help fill that gap in rural areas.
Yeah, I just want to add on that. I think Brian's right. I mean, I think rural areas obviously have, challenging deployment situations. Wireless is in certain rural circumstances, a great kind of technology. As we roll out wireless technologies that have larger channel sizes, more bandwidth, these, I think, lead to better kinds of wireless broadband in rural areas. So I think, that although maybe the millimeter wave band's not the right answer in certain cases because of the propagation issues, that 5G and just the continuing evolution of wireless is a great development for rural.
Mary, would you like to add?
I'd just like to add that 5G is a very flexible technology and enables operators to address use cases that they never before could address. I mean, up until this point, they've been delivering broadband to you and me, which is great. But now we're going to be able to do all kinds of use cases, many of which are pretty compelling for the agriculture community or rural businesses. So the smart people that sit inside of AT&T and these other carriers, the people who are figuring out where they can deploy these services profitably, are now going to have a new equation, right? And I think that will be of benefit to rural America, because they're going to see sort of more of a pull into the hinterlands for 5G technology.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to come back to 3.7 to 4.2 again, we believe particularly in rural areas, there are opportunities to use that 500 megahertz of spectrum, some portion of that 500 megahertz of spectrum in many rural areas in order to provide point-to-multipoint broadband to rural consumers, and again, without disrupting the use of the band. Anything, we just need some minor changes to the Part 101 rules, and we could provide rural broadband point-to-multipoint in 3.7 to 4.2.
Okay, great. I know there's a lot more to talk about when it comes to infrastructure and spectrum and 5G, but we do need to wrap things up. So thank you to all the panelists up here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.